The blade entered just below her left shoulder blade. It sliced between the ribs, puncturing the lung, collapsing it in seconds. She would have drowned in her own blood on the floor of an Egyptian villa 2,600 years ago. But for over a century and a half, the museum in Belfast had her listed as a woman who died peacefully of a brief illness. They were wrong. Let's rewind. 1834 in Belfast, a wealthy landowner named Thomas Gregg travels to Egypt and purchases a mummy. He brings her home. In 1835, in a gaslit room surrounded by local surgeons and curious aristocrats, they cut her open. It was a spectacle. They peeled back the ancient linen, cataloged her amulets, noted her finely braided hair, and declared her a high-status woman named Takabuti. The official narrative was swift and absolute. The 19th century antiquarians needed a romantic trophy for their rising museum, not a brutal murder victim. So they transformed the truth into a myth. They wrote in their journals that she had likely died of a brief, unspecified illness, a peaceful passing. A neat, dignified story that fit perfectly inside a glass display case. Think about that for a second. A woman violently slaughtered, preserved for the afterlife, dragged across Europe, and then stripped of her actual cause of death by men who simply didn't look hard enough. But keep a small detail in mind. When those surgeons peeled back the linen in 1835, they were looking for gold. They counted amulets. They recorded the embalming incision on her abdomen. They noted her perfectly preserved teeth, but they completely missed the trauma in her upper back. The physical evidence was sitting right there in the dark space between her ribs. It would take another 185 years, and a machine that didn't exist when those men were alive, to finally see what they couldn't. In 2020, Takabuti was wheeled into a state-of-the-art CT scanner. No scalpels, no unwrapping, just the uncompromising, unbribable precision of computed tomography. The cross-sectional images populated the monitor. Slice by slice, the 2,600-year-old tissue revealed its secrets. The radiologist examined the density of the bone, the trajectory of the wound. This wasn't a post-mortem injury. There was no fracture callus, no healing whatsoever. The damage was inflicted exactly at the moment of death. But it was the shape of the wound that stopped the investigation cold. It wasn't a thin needle. It wasn't a ceremonial dagger. The kerf, the width of the wound track, was massive. The margins of the fractured rib were pushed inward, indicating a heavy, dense blade driven with extreme force. Forensic modeling definitively established the weapon. An axe-type implement consistent with military blades of the period. An axe is not an assassin's tool. It's a soldier's weapon. A brutal, close-quarters implement. Keep that contradiction in your mind, a high-status woman killed by a battlefield axe in what was likely her own home, because the next step would make it physically real. On the monitor, they did something the Victorian surgeons never could. They stripped away the linen, not with a scalpel, with a mouse, layer by layer. The software dissolved the wrappings, the resin, the desiccated skin, until all that remained was bone. A 3D model of Takabuti's skeleton floated in negative space on the screen, her spine a delicate column of calcified beads. Then the radiologist rotated the view. There, a dark void punched through the back of her upper left chest wall. The software measured the defect in real time. The gap between ribs, the trajectory angling forward and downward, the fractured margin of bone pushed inward, exactly the way ribs break when something heavy enters from behind. They reconstructed the wound track. Virtual soft tissue filled in around the skeleton, and for the first time in 2,600 years, you could see the path the blade took. It slipped between the ribs, missed the spine by centimeters, and opened the pleural cavity. The left lung would have collapsed almost instantly, air and blood flooding the chest, pressure crushing the heart. The orthopedic surgeon on the team, Robert Loynes, later described it in clinical terms: a severe wound to the back of the upper left chest wall, almost certainly causing rapid death. But the scanner showed something else. The 1835 unrolling couldn't. There was no healing, no granulation bone, no signs of infection around the fracture margins. Whatever happened, it happened fast, and it happened at the moment she died. They ran a virtual camera into the defect. On screen, you travel the path the blade traveled, entering below the shoulder blade, slicing through intercostal muscle, breaching the parietal pleura, flooding the thoracic cavity. It's the kind of visual that doesn't belong in a museum gallery. It belongs in a forensic pathology lab. Then the team widened the view. A 20-something woman, curled inside a painted coffin, her heart, contrary to what everyone had assumed for a century and a half, still perfectly preserved inside her chest. A tiny anatomical time capsule, hiding in plain sight while the curators argued over her amulets. They had the cause of death. They had the biomechanics of a killing. Now, they needed to answer the second question, hiding inside her bones. Who was she, really? That answer would come not from bone, but from blood. The team extracted ancient DNA from her bone tissue. Ancient genetic material is a graveyard of degraded fragments, highly vulnerable to contamination. But the computer generated the results. It was a flawless, undeniable match to mitochondrial haplogroup H4A1. Here is where the official story collapses entirely. H4A1 is a matrilineal lineage, strongly associated with ancient and modern European populations. Neither H4 nor H4A1 had been reported in ancient or modern Egyptian databases at the time of analysis. The woman they had displayed for almost 2 centuries as a quintessential ancient Egyptian was, genetically, closer to populations from Europe than to people living in Egypt today. The genetic data doesn't suggest an anomaly. It definitively proves one. Takabuti's DNA undeniably rewrites her identity. She was not genetically what the 19th century collectors assumed she was, and her DNA shatters the simplistic, modern assumptions we project onto ancient population movements. People moved. Empires shifted. European-associated genetic markers were present in the upper echelons of Theban society centuries before the Greeks or Romans arrived. The science is an unforgiving adversary to myth. So now, we have the complete forensic profile. A young, healthy, high-status woman with an extra tooth and an extra vertebra, which were rare anatomical variations noted by the scanning team, murdered from behind by a heavy military axe, no defensive wounds on her arms, a wound to the back of her upper left chest wall that almost certainly caused rapid death. So who drives a soldier's axe into the back of a wealthy, unarmed woman in her own home? The evidence forces us to look at the most violent political upheaval of her era. Takabuti lived during the tumultuous late 25th dynasty, a period ravaged by conflict and foreign campaigns. The physical evidence, a military blade, a high-status victim, a sudden violent death, forces us to ask who actually had the means, the opportunity, and the weapon to commit this specific crime. History is a fragile construct, largely written by those who survived to hold the pen. For 180 years, Takabuti was a peaceful exhibit in a quiet Irish museum. Today, thanks to forensic science, she is a murder victim with a genetically rewritten identity. Her CT scan exposed how she died. Her DNA exposed who she really was. And the Victorian men who dressed her up as a dignified antique, they are no longer the authorities on her story. Science is. This case is closed. But there are thousands of mummies sitting in museum basements right now, holding identical secrets behind their gold leaf. We're cracking them open one by one. Hit subscribe to join the ongoing investigation.